Okay, thank you everybody for getting back on time. And so let's launch right into our next panel. I'm reminded by our communications team, for those of you who are tweeting, that we're tweeting at hashtag ACSS Mali. And I guess there's a good amount of tweeting action going on, so feel free to join in. All right, as we heard in our first panel, the challenges in northern Mali are quite complex. And so if anybody had the illusion that the recent French and West African intervention in northern Mali had accomplished the mission, we should be disabused of that notion. That in fact, the stabilization effort in Mali will be a long-term undertaking, just as we heard this morning that the destabilization process has been slowly evolving over a period of years. And so our second panel this morning is really going to help us build on some of the ideas that came up in our first panel about where we're going moving forward, and trying to identify some of the priorities for that stabilization process, not just on the short term, but over the long term, so that we can talk about a genuinely stable Malian state, and indeed looking at a stable Sahel. We have, I think, really an excellent group of experts to help walk us through this process this morning, covering various aspects of this discussion. We have three new panelists who I'll introduce, and I've asked Dr. Hunipo to join us on the panel as well. I won't ask him to speak, though I'm sure he would jump at the opportunity. But he is up here to help in the discussion for the Q&A afterward. I would like to start with my colleague, Colonel Patrick de Vathaire. He's a colonel in the French Army, and he is the senior French representative at the Africa Center. Patrick, I think, is uniquely qualified to talk to us this morning. He, in fact, was born in Africa and has been schooled there at various points. He's worked professionally in Africa for some 25 years. He's been a military advisor and trainer in half a dozen African countries, including in Chad, Togo, Gabon, Rwanda, and Cote d'Ivoire, among other places. And at one point in his career, he was also working on the Joint Staff in France as part of their Joint Operation Command, which was responsible for strategic planning in Africa, as well as responding to various crises. And among other things, he has dealt with some of the hostage-taking and negotiation crises in Mali and the Sahel in that capacity. So with that, I'd like Patrick to lead us off.
Today, I will not speak about Malian crisis as an official from French government. But I will give you my understanding of the situation in Mali with my French way of thinking and my experience. What is at stake? What will be the way ahead? When Judge Siegle asked me to participate in this panel, I told him the most important thing is military field is not the ongoing French operation, but how it will be coordinated with EU mission and ECOWAS mission. That is, how to build the capacity of the Malian security sector so that it can provide long-term stability in the north. As a rule, I don't think military intervention is the best operation, is the best solution. But what was the best solution for Mali a month ago? And who would set it up? War broke out in Mali in January 2012. and for 1 year, international community discussed about this concern. For the next 10 minutes, I will give you my perspective about the short and mid-term objective of the French military operations, the situation on the ground, and the critical threats remaining in the north. Then I will set out some idea about the way ahead to improve security in Mali and build a Republican army. French goal in January 2013. Malian army, despite Sanogo claims, was not able to stop North forces before Bamako, whatever the international support. The last Malian stronghold was Sévaré. When North forces reached this area, the French forces intervened. On the one hand, to stop jihadist advance and protect French citizens in Bamako, there are about 5,000 French citizens in South Mali. What will happen if ACMI, I am sorry, I say ACMI, not AQIM, Mourao and Ansardine had taken control of Bamako. Today, there are 7 French hostages in Sahel, and I think it's quite enough. On the other hand, to allow or to speed up African forces deployment, to deploy an African forces and an EU mission, airports and main supply roads have to be available. If all Malian airports and all main cities in Mali were under control of North forces, it will be very difficult to deploy outside forces, and it will last much longer. Situation on the ground. After some fights in Gao and along Niger River, North rebels have run away and had avoided directly confronting the Malian and French forces. Today, Gao, Tombouctou, and Kidal, the 3 largest cities in the North Mali, are under control of Malian or French forces. MISMA, Mission Internationale de Soutien au Mali, or International Mission to Support Mali. MISMA deployment is ongoing, and ECOWAS forces are involved in operations inside Mali. Chad, and Chad is not included in ECOWAS, but about 2,000 soldiers are already in Mali. Due to their experience in desert war, they could be involved in struggles in the north. Today, Malian forces are deploying in all large areas along river Niger. Chadian forces are in Kidal, and Niger forces are in Gao. The other MISMA forces are in South Mali, and they will be deployed when they are well equipped. French forces are moving to the north, and they are supporting MISMA and Malian forces. Now, I will talk about the current and future threats as a military. Who is the enemy? There are actually 3 groups: jihadists, Ansardine, and MNLA. First group, jihadists, ACMI and Mourao. 5 or 6 Katibat from ACMI, around 500 fighters before the beginning of the war. These fighters are extremists and terrorists. Many of them are not Malian, and some of their leaders are Algerians. Many people before me speak about that. They have not real political objectives in Mali. Their strategic goal is to secure a safe haven somewhere in the Sahel and fight jihad against Algeria, Western countries, and their allies. They have taken some Western hostages. Mourao, Arab from Mauritania and Mali, which has many links with people trafficking in this area. They took some Algerian hostages and 1 French. Second group, Ansardine, mostly Tuareg fighters who have political goals in Mali, set up the Islamic law in the whole Mali. Many of them came from Libya. and their leader is Liad Ag Ghali, who fell earlier to become the leader of Tuareg people and signed the Tamarasset Agreement in 1992. This agreement between the government of Mali and, on the one hand, and the Mouvement Populaire de l'Azawad et le Front Islamique Arabe, on the other hand, aim to re-establish and to maintain peace and security in all its national territory, and particularly in the Kidal and Gao region. Within the framework of this agreement, the Malian armed forces will disengage from the running of the civil administrations in the north and will proceed to the suppression of certain military posts. The third group, MNLA, a secular Tuareg group, the MNLA claimed independence of Azawad in January 2012. Since 1960, the Tuareg have been involved in many rebellions, and they have been engaged in many talks with Malian officials. In recent weeks, they have said they will fight against terrorists in North Mali alongside French forces. These three groups are very scattered. They are not under the command of only one general. Where are the bad guys? If you look at the North Mali map, they can go into hiding in Adad des Ifoga, north of Kidal, and along Algerian borders. If they stay in west, along Mauritanian border, or in south, along Niger River, airstrikes will destroy them. Adrar des Ifoga is not a very accessible area. Not many wells, no road, no large cities. What they can do? We can speculate about what they will do next. I think French military strikes have destroyed a large part of jihadist military capability, in particular logistical bases, stock of gas and ammunition, and many trucks. Many Tuareg fighters could agree to take part in negotiations with Malian government under the lead of MNLA or other rebel movements. However, the most hardline of the militants can, first, hide themselves in this area in the north of Mali and wait until French and outside forces will withdraw. They have many heavy weapons, as surface-to-air missiles, rocket launchers. But in Adrar des Ifoga, it will be difficult to use them in offensive way. If they go out, French fighters will strike them. As I said earlier, terrorists should preserve a safe haven if they want to survive. They will be able to fight for defending their strongholds in Adrar des Ifoga. Second, they can run away to South Libya because they could find a safe haven there. But they have to go through Algeria and Niger. And today, these two countries are involved in the coalition against them. They cannot easily bring with them many heavy weapons. Algeria has threatened its borders and has kept a close watch since events in Amenas. In other areas of North Mali, maybe some incidents will take place. But today, population is scared by recent events. They will try to survive, and they will not provide any support to jihadists. In short, terrorists cannot conduct coordinated offensive or significant action against French and allied forces. What should be done to help the new Malian army? From my perspective, the two main challenges are how to build a reliable and inclusive army with democratic values. And second, how can the poorly equipped security forces control a wide empty desert? Since independence, after each Tuareg rebellion, an agreement has been signed. In each agreement, you could find the withdrawal of South Malian forces from most parts of the north, integration of Tuareg fighters in Malian forces, the setting up of special Tuareg units to carry out security missions in North Mali, But this solution failed in 1992, 1996, and 2006. Keep in mind that soldiers from the north deserted and joined rebel Tuareg forces at the outset of every crisis. To set up a republican army, you need a fair representation of every part of population and mutual trust between each element, how to articulate units and control and command at each level, national, regional, and local. Maybe the case of Niger could be a good example about how to manage this concern. After some rebellions, Tuareg population is better integrated in political game, and sharing of power is more balanced between north and south, even if some concern are still there. The second point is how to organize efficient forces to deal with a very large and empty country. Security forces have to intervene in remote areas with short notice. Security forces have to be equipped with light planes, helicopters, signal assets. In other words, mobility is essential, and security forces should also better manage many intelligence sources. If you know what is going on, it will be easier to take the right decisions. But to achieve this goal, you have to gain trust of the population. And today, in North Mali, the population doesn't really trust Malian army. EU mission is going to arrive in Bamako in February and will train the first Malian battalion in March. That will be its first mission, restore the trust in the scattered Malian army, Sanogo and his followers, Malian soldiers loyal to ATT, Abadi Touré, and Tuareg's units. The way ahead for the French forces. French forces and its allies will keep fighting on Acme and Mokao in North Mali, in Adrar des Ifoga. In the same time, French forces will back ECOWAS mission and support African armies' engagement in logistic and intelligence fields. French forces will also support deployment and setting up of EU mission. I think French officials know only that only the first step on the path of recovery is done. But now all parts of the Malian society should share the burden and implement Malian solutions to solve Malian issues, and the way ahead will be long.
Okay, thank you very much, Patrick. Okay, so Colonel de Vathaire has led out for us and laid out some of the priorities that he sees moving forward. For the short term, he talks about the importance of aerial support and logistics support for whatever remaining force is going to be positioned in the region. And what he has put forward is the importance of a hybrid force of an African and EU/French force that can help push forward stability in the short term. Over the medium term, he has talked about the need for reform in the Malian army in many facets, and he has touched on a focal point on who and what kind of forces should be deployed in the north. Historically, the notion was that the Tuareg are best suited to do that, but as he has pointed out, that hasn't worked in the past, and so maybe a more integrated, or as he determines it, a republican force, as is used in Niger, is the more appropriate way to move forward. Over the long term, he highlights the importance of local support, gaining local support, and the revealing observation he makes is that currently local populations don't trust the militants, so they're not necessarily predisposed to supporting them, but they also don't trust the government. So their support is up for grabs in terms of what comes next, and that's something I think we'll be touching on here as we move forward. The next speaker on our panel is Dr. Johanna Mendelson Forman. She is a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Johanna is not a Mali expert, and that's purposeful because we wanted to try to bring in some fresh eyes and some thematic expertise to the discussion. And I think Johanna may be the best person we could draw on for that. She's worked on post-conflict reconstruction and stabilization issues for many years. She was the co-director in helping to create the Office of Transition Initiatives at USAID when that was established. She was co-director of a landmark study that was released, I think, just 10 years ago at CSIS that did a comparative analysis of post-conflict reconstruction operations and lessons learned. And over the years, she's supported that in many ways. In this past year, she, in some ways, did a follow-up report that was released under the title Inevitable Conflicts, Avoidable Failures, Preparing for the Third Generation of Conflict, Stabilization, and Reconstruction Operations. And so with that, let me turn it over to you, Johanna.
Well, thank you, Joe, for making me feel older than I am, and also for allowing me to join the ranks of these tremendously talented experts on Mali to be joining this part of the world. I heard someone in the first panel said that Mali was a direct shot to South America, which in fact it is. I think to Brazil, actually, to northern Brazil. So I feel a little bit of comfort in the fact that many of the lessons from the parts of the world that I've worked in bear over. But I am, at the end of the day, a civil-military relations person, and I think the themes in that field transcend many of the borders and what we know about how to manage the relationships between governments and civilians and their respective militaries. But I'm going to start by briefly saying a couple of things, and that is from the report that we did in the summer last year of looking back on 10 years of learning, we really are operating with a certain assumption that for the United States government, foreign internal conflicts are going to remain a permanent feature of our foreign policy landscape for the next decade. And so this is an issue, whether it's Mali or whether it's any other place in the world, it's going to dominate our thoughts. And you can just look at the press to see that it comes up again and again, including many very interesting stories about the background of how we got to where we were as far as U.S. foreign policy goes. It's also interesting that since 1993, and there's been a very good study done by the Center for New American Security, that we've had 21 foreign internal conflicts and twice as many humanitarian responses in those years. And so it's a business that we're going to be in, and certainly we know that. And our government is going to be called upon many times in the future to stabilize countries, whether we're doing it alone or with partners, we're going to be there. So the question that I think we need to ask is first, how do we do things differently? And I think there are specific points to be raised. Is we're not always going to be in the lead, which is obvious given the comments of our colleague here that the French went in, took the lead, and then worked through the United Nations and other partners as well. We're going to work to address conflicts on the ground, and we're going to do it multilaterally more than ever. And I will go into what I mean by first-generation post-conflict work, which we actually worked on multilaterally. And we're going to have many more national voices in the planning process, something that the Colonel referred to as the need for the voices of Malians to find the solutions. We're going to expand the partnerships we have because there are 40 fragile states in the world that have great economic potential, and we need to be able to understand how this potential can help build stronger societies. And we're going to take as inevitable the fact that jihadists are going to be emerging in the space that's available as long as there is a lack of governance, lack of socioeconomic opportunities, and we're going to take that as a given. Now, I was trying to make comparisons with other places in the world I know. And first I said, well, this is like Colombia, a country I've worked in, where you have a movement that went after the Cold War from an ideological movement into a pure gangster-like operation because the FARC, which are now in peace negotiations, and hopefully they'll have a settlement in the next year, were actually supporting themselves on two things, on drug money and kidnappings, similar to what AQIM is doing. But there's one difference. There was never a war against the West with the FARC. It was a contained conflict. It stayed in the Andean region. And what you see, however, is that the criminalization of the drug war is what is really expanded into the African continent. And that is not something out of an ideological game, but rather something I'll address later on transnational issues. The other country that it brought to mind, and I'm glad Sharon Bean is on the panel because that's where I first met her, as I said, Mali is like Haiti on steroids. It's, it's the size of Texas and a huge country. But in fact, when you look at the aid statistics that have gone into Mali, and I went to thank heavens that USAID has a foreign aid dashboard at last, and you can look at the percentages of aid. Despite $143 million having gone in the last fiscal year to Mali, the bulk of that money goes into socioeconomic projects through direct support, budget support, and it also goes in terms of beneficiaries into the center, into Bamako. Now, where did this rebellion take place? It didn't take place in Bamako, although I think it's absolutely important that you rescued your 5,000 French nationals there. This conflict is a rural conflict. And most countries that have strong urban areas and then weak rural areas with many porous borders are often neglected in the aid planning. And some of it has to do with the way security is. Aid workers can't get out to these areas. But nevertheless, it is a sign and symptomatic of what happens to countries with poor, unequal rural areas that truly are left off the development map. So we should think about that as we move ahead. But I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you about what these generations of conflict are to see if you agree with our conclusions and to see how some of the lessons fit. Oh, thank you, sir. I thought I had a loud voice, but not loud enough, apparently. You know, the first generation, as we defined it, was 1989 to 2001, which all of us around the table have been involved in. These were the significant military interventions, Somalia, Haiti, Rwanda, the Balkans. They were based on humanitarian principles. They had lots of bilateral donors. The UN was involved. But the thing that's very interesting that the commonality of this first generation had was they had peace accords. They had agreements which provided very dedicated roadmaps as to how to get out of this trap. If you look at the Central American Accords as the earliest post-war accords, these were roadmaps for civil-military relations. They defined the demobilization, the segregation of forces. They defined the way the police would work. And actually, the democracy part of these interventions was that the U.S. and other donors held elections. That was our exit strategy. So you have these two features, civil-military relations through a roadmap and also the election exit strategy. What we did do in the U.S. government is, from a policy perspective, we decided we had to coordinate, and what we had was this Presidential Policy Directive 56. All of you are familiar with it. It was the first effort to bring together the interagency to look at the various equities that people brought to the table. Whether they talked truth to power and the equities they had is another debate, but we won't go into it. But in fact, we had that guiding principle. We got into a second generation starting in 2001 after September 11th, and that period went into 2011. And that was based on a couple of things. We knew that we had to develop a new framework in which to take the PDD 56 operation and put it into a level where we identified essential tasks that we'd have to do and identified who would have to do them, and also put this on a timeline to show that there was a short, medium, and long-term concept to post-conflict or conflict stabilization, as it later became known. And the main feature that I would say, which shifted particularly after the invasion of Afghanistan and then into Iraq, was the shift in the U.S. government interagency, which gave the Department of Defense the institutional lead in managing what was once more an integrated development and security operation. And I think that's where some of the challenges that we see today arise, in that an agency whose lead is and strength is in military force and in short-term types of solutions, the task was given to an institution that did not have the medium to long-term capacities to deal with the kinds of problems articulated by our first panel in the long history or in the kinds of questions that we understand there. Even though in 2005 the Department of Defense made a commitment to stability operations as part of its doctrine in the Directive 3000.05, the balance with the State Department to establish reconstruction as a mission both for the military and the civilians was still lagging, mainly due to resources. So in the first generation of these conflicts, which we saw, which I mentioned, that went from internal wars, we went to a second generation, which was specific interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan primarily, which were actually invasions that had to do with a fighting of an insurgency. We also went to find out that a lot of the problems that we were trying to address were borderless. And the UN did a great deal in terms of creating the intellectual background for this by talking about looking at collective security and thinking about how these threats no longer fit the paradigm of the general UN Charter. I mean, how do you deal with organized crime? How do you deal with trafficking? How do you deal with proliferation of weapons? How do you deal with climate change as causing humanitarian crises? There was a high-level panel on threats, challenges, and change. I only recommend you read the executive summary. The U.S. representative on that panel, which was mainly internationals, was General Brent Scowcroft, who actually, I think, had one of the most important influences in taking where the U.S. policy was and then translating it and making borderless threats a centerpiece of the way our own U.S. government would think. So what is the opportunity for this third generation that we're in? That is dealing with, from 2011 to the present, where we have these borderless threats, and the generation that is plagued by another problem. As we watch Capitol Hill today, I mean, not to mention the debate on sequesters and Secretary Panetta's remarks that it can't be done that way, there is a high level of skepticism in our political dialogue about these kinds of operations. And I think they have a corrosive effect on our ability as a country to respond to what I think are inevitable conflicts. These are not going away. And yet our ability to manage them is being chipped away at, not because of the reality on the ground, but because of the way our own budgets are being impacted by these cross-the-board potential cuts, but also a lack, I think, of understanding of are living in a globalized world. No more comments on politics, but I do say it has a very detrimental effect to the way you organize yourself if you don't know if you have money from one year to the other in terms of a long-term strategy. All right, but I have to be a positive and opportunity person as well, because in this generation there are lots of opportunities. I see I think 7 of them. And one is there are opportunities now more than ever to increase coordination with transition partners. And some of this is already happening on the development side. There are joint assessment teams that go out by the World Bank and the UN and the development agencies, rather than sending all of these people out to interview the same officials of government that then have no time to manage their own work. You have a greater involvement of regional organizations, of ECOWAS in the case of, and the African FISMA, the African Security Force, which has been put together by the UN Security Council to work regionally. And I don't discount these powers. Whatever you think about them, this is important to have this local command. I also did not hear anybody mention the role of some of the emerging powers as donors. The G7 plus, which came out of the Busan Accord, there are new donors in these fragile states. There are Brazilians, there are Turks, there are Chileans, there are Chinese. How do we engage these new donors that may not have that much money, but really want a stake in what they see as part of their South-South agenda? And how do we, as a government, look at these new donors, since sometimes our aims are not necessarily consistent, but yet these people who are donors want to play? I think we're also taking a more pragmatic approach in the engagement and understanding de facto authorities and non-state actors, something we did not do well before. And the other factor, which is very interesting, is the growing role of the private sector in wanting to engage on these security discussions. The bottom line for many of these companies is the security of the state. And it's not only the extractive industries, it's the Procter & Gamble's, it's the people who want to invest in this part of the world. Africa is a very fast-growing region economically, and there are companies that are watching how we work in the field. It's also interesting that even more obvious is that these situations obviously don't lend themselves to military solutions in the long run. Certainly, the intervention by the French army and the actions were an emergency necessity that had to be done. But the institutions of justice, the fighting of corruption, and addressing inequality are not going to be solved through military tools. They're just not the right tools. So what stands out in Mali is here we took for granted a country that in 2007 was at the pinnacle of its democratic period. It was head of the Community of Democracies. I remember that people going there and handing over the Community of Democracy to Mali. And yet we overlooked some of the other warning signs, the deep inequality, the wealthier South, the poorer North, and the other fact that the NGOs are growing in Mali. They actually are growing. If you look at the number, this is something that one cannot discount, and this is very important, and I do think may have had some impact of foreign aid, which foreign aid I think does best, is do NGOs. We know how to do NGOs and support people. But this assistance at the local level, the greater need for microcredit, the need for health care, the need for energy security is essential, and this is going to be important. The other thing that I've looked at in looking at the strategy, the counterterrorism strategy for the region, is that prevention techniques we always know are a long-term investment, and we still do not think of things beyond 5-year increments. To prevent conflict is a wonderful concept. To operationalize it is a long-term investment, and that is not an investment only by external actors, but by citizens of the country themselves. And I think what's inspiring now in watching the scenes out of Mali and these towns that have been liberated from the AQIM is the potential capacity of Malians themselves to become engaged in this issue. I must admit that the one gap that I see, which is stunning in every article that I've read, is the absence of addressing women in Mali as leaders. We know, and we have a UN Resolution 1325, we have the National Plan of Action in the United States, that it's not about women as the end, but women are the means towards peaceful resolution of many of these conflicts, and also incorporating them in the armed services, in the police, which are very much needed. We have evidence that they are there. I have not seen, at least in my reading, please correct me if I'm wrong, much that addresses the role of half the population of any country into this solution, and I think it would be an important point to discuss. So finally, I just want to make 2 more points because I'm almost out of time, and that is we are still using a strategy of tactics rather than a strategy of long-term planning. What we have are tools. We have lots of tools, but we don't integrate them in a way which does not add up to a strategy in the case of Mali. And I think this is a very important point. I think as a government and as many people, we don't understand the threat. Yes, we know this is AQIM. We know there are other people. But the threat is also the socioeconomic questions that can undermine countries, can create grievances that are long and historical, that several panelists in the first panel mentioned, of historic and deep-rooted ethnic identity questions, which transcend some of the more immediate jihadist types of issues. We also have drugs, insurgencies, transnational crimes, which are not going away, and we should take some of those lessons of drugs which are being used. And for example, the Brazilians are now using public health as a means to deal with the drug threats. The Malians are not drug addicts, but there are mechanisms that one could use to deal with some of the issue of trafficking that might be helpful. So finally, I just want to quote something, and with all respect to my French colleague, I was reading the statement that your dear President François Hollande said as he was departing Bamako over the weekend, and it caught my eye in the context of these 3 generations. And he said, now it's the Malians who have the responsibility to assure the transition, and especially the security of their country. This farewell comment underscores 3 lessons we failed to learn. 1, local ownership does not mean abandoning support for security assistance because transitions are a long-term process. Second, the principles of the Busan Declaration, which stress the need for national ownership and planning, don't seem to be, and correct me if I'm wrong, part of the long-term planning process in France. I'm not sure, so I only say this. And we still look to military solutions as an important way to achieving the short-term resolution of conflicts without synchronizing our socioeconomic needs that remain. I was gratified to hear, however, that there are discussions about elections for July. And then I started to think, is this yet another exit strategy for the international community once again? So I'll leave it there because there's much more we could say and more people that are much more talented than I am on this subject. But this is just from someone who's worked in other parts of the world on many conflicts to see how these pieces might fit into what is indeed a challenge, but also not a lost cause. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Johanna. You've given us a lot to think about, and I'm sure that will stimulate a lot of response in our Q&A. Just to highlight a few of priorities she's thrown out for us, what I've heard here is the importance of multilateralism, that you are going to need these sort of both hybrid coalitions to address the short and the medium-term challenges, and that this has to have both a local and international component to it. You made a very, I think, trenchant point about the mismatch between a lot of our security assistance structures and the types of underlying drivers to the instability in Mali and other stabilization context, and need to really give more thought about how we need to be organized as international partners to provide the sustained support dealing with the socioeconomic issues, the governance issues, but also on the security side. You talk about the importance of dealing with the criminal element and the criminal networks, which may require different types of security interventions than what we would normally do with a conventional threat. And I also heard you bring out, importantly, the need of following the money on development, that too often resources are brought in to capital cities. They don't make it to the marginalized areas where a lot of instability is percolating. And this may and often does require a lot of cooperation with NGOs, that NGOs are part of the mechanism to build some of that local support that we talk about as being important. And you flag the importance of giving more attention to women as a partner in that process. All right, let's go to our final speaker for this panel. Sharon Bean is a development consultant with Encompass, and she brings many years of experience working in the Sahel. She, for the last 7 years, has been advising the TSCTP process, the Trans-Sahel Counterterrorism Partnership process, on development programming. And simultaneously to that, she has been working with USAID as an advisor to provide the design and assessment strategies to combat violent extremism. She's worked throughout the Sahel, and that includes Mali, where she's done multiple assessments and missions there, evaluating progress on these issues, including a recent trip she has just returned from in December. So with that, Sharon, please take over.
Thank you, Joe. Okay, good. Good morning, everybody. Are we still here? Yes? I want to kind of hear good morning from everybody. I'm sorry, I'm a facilitator. So thank you. It's my pleasure to be here today to discuss how and what development responses can contribute to stabilizing northern Mali. While time does not allow for a complete inventory of development initiatives that have been conducted by multiple development actors over the past 10 or 15 years. I will focus on a couple of development initiatives that have demonstrated impact on mitigating conflict drivers in the region. Specifically, my comments will focus on two key areas that seem critical to Mali at this particular juncture and in light of historical grievances. First, I'll speak a little bit about governance and governance programs, and secondly, I'll speak a little bit about communications and its role in stabilization in the region. Stability, as we all know, is directly related to governance. In the context of northern Mali, ungoverned spaces are potential and have proven to be sanctuaries for terrorists. Governance fills the void, and good governance, ideally, provides basic services such as schools, roads, and security for citizens to lead productive lives. One of the most cited grievances and conflict assessments conducted in northern Mali in 2009 and again in 2011 was the weakness of the state, oftentimes stated as the relative or virtual absence of the state in Kidal, Gao, and Timbuktu regions. The lack of state authorities is a major driver of underdevelopment and insecurity. In 2010, as the violence erupted and kidnappings escalated in northern Mali, the international community urged the government of Mali to come up with a response. And while the timing might have been a little bit inappropriate, just in terms of, who could envision what was going to happen over the next few years, the government of Mali came up with a unique initiative called the PSPSDN, which is the Special Program for Security, Development, and Peace in Northern Mali. Given that development necessitates a certain modicum of security in order to be conducted and effective, this response seems to be even more appropriate now as we think about what's next for Mali, now that the situation has actually calmed down even a little bit. PSPSDN is designed to provide security and development activities in the most sensitive regions of northern Mali. PSPSDN envisioned the installation of secured poles in 11 sensitive security locations. The core of each pole is a military contingent, security forces, whose provision of security will enable the establishment of civil administration. PSPSDN's approach would not only address certain security vulnerabilities, it would also seek to address socioeconomic issues, and it included the construction of certain facilities in Gao, Kidal, and in Timbuktu. Specifically, PSPSDN was designed to provide security and development along 5 axes. Security, per se, addressing governance issues, local development, communication, and management. When it was first conceived, it was conceptualized as a 2-year timeline, which we can all see was maybe a little overambitious. But the project enjoyed support from the EU, France, Denmark, and Canada. So in terms of support from the international donor community, there was a certain buy-in to how useful this approach would be in securing governance in the northern regions. PSPSDN itself stated that only a secure and civilly engaged local population can serve as the eyes and ears to alert security forces of undesirable elements. Now, while the concept of PSPSDN may be appropriate for the current construct, there are a couple of tweaks that would necessitate it being even more effective. For example, while PSPSDN recognizes the importance of local communities and their role in alerting to security issues and things that are happening in their area, the conceptualization of PSPSDN was not done in concert with local communities or civil society organizations. It was a very top-down approach where, again, kind of the group in the south came together, thought about what would be an appropriate response, and then kind of delivered it to the north. So it would benefit in the future if it were actually to be stood up, which would be an appropriate response, to consider broad-based consultations and to recognize the fact that the folks who are living in these ungoverned territories over hundreds of years have survived and have thrived in these very unforgiving environments. They have resiliency strategies. They have tools for coping with interlopers. They know how to manage conflict, and they have notions for how both to secure the area, and their participation in the program is necessary for both buy-in, ground truthing, and providing solutions that are appropriate to the zone. Consultations will also contribute to helping Northerners overcome their skepticism of Southern-based solutions. And as we all know, and it's been stated on the panel on a couple of occasions, central government in the past is used to making promises that they don't follow up with. So in order for this kind of program to be successful, it should be both realistic, and the government of Mali should be in a position to be able to actually staff up these polls that they're suggesting. So it may be, with the current situation in Mali, that this notion of secure polls may in fact be something that the international community has to participate in. Perhaps it's a joint organization between the international community and the Malian government, but in the name of the government of Mali taking over control of its northern areas, this approach seemed to make sense. Okay, so the second piece that also seems to be critical to stabilization in Mali, which the development community has been working in for many, many years and has a wealth of understanding and experience and has proven results in many other countries in the region, including Chad and Niger, is the role of radio, and specifically the role of community radio. In northern Mali, there are more than 50 community radios throughout the northern regions. Community radio is widely recognized as a highly effective means of communication among dispersed, largely illiterate listeners in the north, and radio is the primary means of communicating in Mali. The importance of communication at this particular juncture in Mali cannot be overstated. It has a multi-pronged effect, and the initial response would be appropriate in places like Timbuktu, who have suffered under 10 months of occupation, and there's a need to kind of recapture leadership, direction, and the dialogue that's going on there. It's also important to think about the role of radio in peace and reconciliation. We've all heard what's going on in Timbuktu with the random looting of Arab stores by the local population to reivindicate what had been going on for the past 10 months. This threatens the very integrity of these multi-ethnic towns that have survived thousands of years and need each other in order to survive in the future. So the role of radio in being able to pacify those angers, give voice, is critical at this point. I'll tell a story about when I was in Bamako in 2012, in December. I happened to be there when the soft coup happened. I was delivering some work, and everybody knew that the prime minister had been forcibly removed from office in the middle of the night on a Sunday evening. I happened to be in a room full of USAID folks, mostly Malian, and everybody waited on Monday with great anticipation for some statement from the executive branch to explain what had happened and what the plans were for the future. Instead, the whole entire day passed, and there was not a single communique from central government to explain what the conditions were and what the future was. In a place less volatile, in a place more volatile than Mali, that could have resulted and erupted in any number of demonstrations and other violent acts. as Johanna mentioned, she and I have spent some time in Haiti, and I can tell you an act like that would have set the place on fire. Instead, there was a communique in the middle of the night at about 8 o'clock to explain, yes, he's been removed, and yes, we have somebody else to replace him. Opportunities like that in the North, where there's that void of communication information, could easily be exploited to nefarious and sometimes violent ends. So to stabilize the North, information circulation, consultation is essential both from the government and from the communities. There's a wealth of information and materials already developed on peace and tolerance messaging. And it would be appropriate to kind of pull out what we've done in the past in order to apply it to the immediate situation there. Radio has proven to be extremely effective in conflict and post-conflict settings around the world, and taking control of the message is part of what the government needs to do now in order to ensure stability. Also, radio has proven to be very effective in anti-corruption activities. And we've spoken a little bit about the role of corruption and the role of government, but community radio also helps the community understand what's going on and filter that information back. So lastly, I'd just like to say that community radio has played a very important role in fostering moderate voices and interfaith dialogues and providing interpretations on Quranic texts in Niger in particular. As more conservative ideology continues to trickle into northern Mali, community radio can be a forum where groups can discuss and debate how that information is going to be received and or integrated and or rejected into their daily lives. So in closing, community radio has the potential to make linkages within and across communities. It has the potential to reinforce peace and stability, to weave even distant communities into a national dialogue and give youth a voice and a forum to discuss issues, voice concerns, and propose solutions. Through radio and something like the PSPSDN, security and civilian leaders can extend their reach, know better what is happening in the region, and include a broader population base into solutions to preserve Mali's national identity and integrity.
Thanks very much, Sharon. And you two have highlighted a number of things that can help us sort of paint some sort of canvas of how we move forward in Mali and within the region. Your emphasis on community radio seems to highlight several things. One, we've talked about the importance of gaining the trust of local populations. And you're prioritizing for us that this is a vehicle for doing so. And presumably, this has to come from a trusted source. The messages have to come from a trusted source, and so that may be, again, NGOs rather than the government at this point. But that there is receptivity there, that the vehicle exists where this hasn't been the case in previous decades in northern Mali. And what I heard you say is, in many ways, that vehicle provides a means for listening as well as talking to local communities, and in that way helping to prioritize what the development sectors of concentration should be, rather than going in there with preconceived notions of what the priorities are, to really use that as a vehicle to get that local participation and ownership, and with that, allow that to guide the process more than it has in the past. And you've neatly tied that vehicle to not just the development side, but the countering violent extremism challenge, that we need to recognize that there are other messages coming out from the militants They are also trying to compete for the support of local populations. And this also provides a vehicle to shine a light of transparency on abuse of, misuse of funds. You've also helpfully, I think, shown us that, or reminded us that we're not starting from scratch in northern Mali, that there has been a well-developed, well-conceived development, an integrated development initiative in northern Mali for a number of years, but it hasn't been effective, or as effective as it could have been or should have been. And I think echoing Johanna's point about top-down, that if this is going to be restructured, there needs to be a focus at the local level. There needs to be that local buy-in if you're going to get the stabilization and development benefits from it. And I guess in sum, what I'm hearing, perhaps a theme, is there needs to be greater focus on accountability in any sort of stabilization development effort moving forward in Mali, that you can't just trust the government to do the right thing in this circumstance. Not that they're incapable, it is a matter of that given the historical lack of institutions and that lack of precedence of how you facilitate cooperations, that we can't just assume that money going in is going to achieve the ends that we're looking at. And so we can unpack that further as well. So with that summary, we can open it up for more questions and comments. I thought the first round was exemplary in terms of the brevity and clarity and real insight that was provided. As I said, we'll have 4 panelists to respond. Dr. Matt Hunipo will be here to help us on some of the governance and historical issues as well. So let's start here. Okay.
Thank you. Barwende from Africa Faith and Justice Network. My question will address Mr. Patrick. From colonization, France and French invited themselves into Africa, and no one ignores how evil colonization is, and many violations of human rights happen through colonization. Until now, France has not yet recognized this evil. And today, France is back into Mali after Libya and Ivory Coast. Please, extend to which are Africa and Africans free to collaborate with France? Second, what is the difference between what is happening now into Mali and what's happened during colonization era? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll go over here, back over there.
Yeah, Richard Jascott, Director for Stabilization Development at Creative Associates and a former Commandant of the National War College. But I find it interesting when we talk about Mali and give it a size, we compare it to Texas, and then we wonder with all of our support there why that government hasn't fixed its porous borders. But given that, how do, the movement of transnational things across Mali and the rest is important to the U.S., and that's one of the things we worry about. Given that the next government in transition is going to be trying to reconnect with its population, support its population, gain its support of its population, how important should that be to that government?
Okay, thank you very much. Back over here.
Thank you. David Throop, CSIS Africa program, and Johns Hopkins University. And in the 1990s, I was the British Foreign Office analyst for Mali. I think we're lumping too many things in one basket. I think we actually have to disaggregate the different parts of northern Mali, and we can't treat it as one particular coherent block. We're also assuming that the failure of the Malian state to establish an effective presence in northern Mali is part of the problem. I'm not sure of that. I think if you look at the history of northern Mali, both during the French colonial period and since independence, governmental control has actually been extraordinarily slender. Things didn't really change in 1960. And you can almost correlate the incidence of northern Malian rebellion with the attempts by the government in Bamako, or the government in Paris for that matter, to actually establish a more effective presence. The Tuareg and the Peul may argue that they want greater incorporation into the Malian state. But when the government attempts to bring it about, whether they do that because of incompetence or not, I don't know, it actually provokes a backlash. And I think it's not particularly strange that we have a backlash now, given the attempt by the government in Bamako to create these 11 centers of stability. Because what was the first concept is what we need more military presence in northern Mali, and military presence in northern Mali provokes resistance, provokes violence. And so we have a conundrum. How do we actually create peace in a state where if you try to bring in military force, you exacerbate the crisis rather than resolve it? Now, in Niger, the last presenter this morning talked about the dealing with the Tuareg in Niger and compared it with Mali. I would say he got it completely wrong. It is the Malians who have gone out of their way repeatedly over the last 50 years to try and negotiate and to create some kind of consociational structure. In Niger, the government castigated these guys as terrorists. The government actually used major military force to crush the MNJ. And only after it had been militarily crushed did they then resort to a form of indirect rule, co-opting local clan leaders and backing away. The Malian government have tried to do the same, but they have never really adopted a military strategy to crush resistance. But the fundamental problem in in Mali is, of course, the ethnic divide, which I think is much worse than in Niger. The Tuareg and the groups can be accommodated more in Niger, whereas in Mali, there is profound alienation of the north. Malians in the north don't really want to be part of Malian state. That is a fundamental problem.
Okay.
And the government in Bamako is trying to bring them back.
Thank you.
It seems to me, let me just have my last word, that we're looking at it from the perspective of Washington, we're looking at it from the perspective of Bamako. We're not looking at it from the perspective of Tessalit or Guitar. And if we did that, we would have a very, very different set of solutions.
Okay, thank you very much. A good thought and challenge to think about how we really can functionally integrate northern Mali and all of its parts. So I'd like to turn either to Matt or Patrick. Would you like to start? And then, yeah, okay.
I will not answer the first question because I will never convince you that the colonization for the French people is in the history. But I think your question is very interesting, and you can ask this question in population in Tombouctou or Gao, not at me. I will never convince you. I am not a colonialist because I live in the 21st century. This is the first question. And I think for the Western population, Western countries, and for the French, it's very, very easy to deploy forces everywhere in the world. But any Western country, US, France, Britain, know how to build a nation or to bring the development. This is the main concern. How to do? And the political official in France or in US or in everywhere don't know how to do, to develop Mali, to develop northern Mali, to help Chad, to help CAR, help everywhere in the world. This is a real concern. How to do?
Well, let me just, as far as the first question is concerned, I, for one, I have the tendency to, colonization is a reality and nobody can deny it. But believe it or not, neocolonialism is more severe than colonialism itself. What I mean by that is what Africans who are in charge now, the way they are treating their people. If you are to go back and compare and contrast, to me it's more painful what I'm seeing on the continent coming from our own brothers and sisters blood. Okay? Now, second point, even if you have some, let's say, agreement, accord, defense, or whatever, you have a possibility to denounce an accord. If you have a cooperation agreement or whatever, legally there's a possibility also to say, well, I don't want France anymore. But while on the one hand, we keep blaming the West, everybody, on the second, when we have problems, we turn to them. I don't get it. There seems to be some problem. We need to figure out what we want, as far as I'm concerned, as an African. Now, situation before and now, as I said, if you know anything about international relations 101, countries are going to go after their national interest no matter what you say, no matter what you do. The question whether you know your national interest and how do you allow them to come or not come is up to you. That's how I see. For transnational issue, I think it's very important, once again. But now the question is whether countries are going to really come together. And as I said earlier, the West, they got to go in. But now how do they go in? Together or differently with what type of agenda? To me, that's where lies the problem. Not whether they should go in or not. They have to because of the nature, the scope of the issue right now. For my British friend, maybe I got it wrong. Sometimes you can go to the same movie and get out with different interpretation. I don't know what your sources are. I'm not going to question that. But what I know is repression alone did not resolve the situation in Niger. And I talked to a lot of folks out there because way back to 1960 in Mali, Modibo, repression has been used in Mali too. So repression alone, security alone cannot address the issue we are talking about. You got to bring some development into that. Think about the genuine grievances and address them. So if you think repression alone was what happened in Niger, that might be your reading or your interpretation of the movie. It wasn't mine. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to check with Sharon. Sharon, did you have anything to add on any of those questions?
No, that's okay.
Okay, go ahead.
Just one quick point on the transnational issue, and it's something that I had in my papers but didn't go to. I think the way we look at some of these questions, country by country, in this piecemeal approach, does not take into account that Mali is part of a broader region. We put this in the context of the Sahel. And porosity of borders is a problem. It predated this conflict. It continues. And I think you're asking, in our toolkit, what do we have to work not only in a bilateral sense to encourage a better solution for borders, but also to figure out regionally how these policies integrate so that you are able to support a fairly weak state that needs this. And should this be a priority within the training of the forces that are coming forward in terms of resources, if that is your problem being transnational crime?
Okay, no, thank you very much, Johanna, for that. And that has been a theme that we've heard from several panelists, that priorities for moving forward certainly involve greater cooperation within the region, the Sahel, involving the Maghreb, and then internationally as well. Okay, we're open for another round of questions, please.
Thank you very much. Richard Loban from the Naval War College. And just pursuing that last point, some parts in the first panel are continued in the second one. And one is the Perhaps this would be directed to our French colonel in a more friendly manner, but in the post-in-Menas context, it seems that the Algerian government, formerly a French colony, is much more incentivized to deal with this problem of porosity of borders and perhaps really going on to the north side of the mountains. The other comment or question which has been so far neglected is the stabilization of Libya. Clearly, the small arms and light weapons which have flowed from the post-Gaddafi era are critical for the upsurge of the Ansar ad-Din and ACMI or Akim forces. So perhaps someone would talk about stabilization, regional stabilization, following your comment of Libya, and then perhaps some specific post in Menas commentary. Thank you.
Colonel Ignatius Wogu from Nigeria, a student of College of International Security Affairs here in NTU. I want to agree with the last speaker on the issue that what happened in Mali is failure of governance. Be that as it may, if the area occupied by the terrorists are reclaimed, will that solve Malians' problem? I feel that Malians' issue is that of economy. Do they have the money to sustain the maintenance of that country? If they don't have, then I think the international community will do well by providing resources for them to govern their country. The space left out there, which is now occupied by the terrorists, if reclaimed, then a local force made up of the people themselves can be trained, and they will police the place. And then with the adequate economic help from the international community, I think the problem will be solved. But it's not going to be a very short while. It's going to be a long-term program. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. And then back here on my right.
Hi, Angela Martin with USAID, and this is a two-parter that's kind of linked. First, is there examples of other countries where stabilization programs are operated where one part of the country was very much affected and another part wasn't? So you have 10 months of occupation and the conflict in the north, and the south is basically untouched. The second part is how you would deal with the fact that the Tuaregs are actually blamed for the problem and not the terrorists, and the Southerners don't see any role in the 50 years of this problem. So how would you address that in a positive way?
Okay, thank you very much. So again, the challenge of the reintegration and how to engage Tuaregs and other local communities in the north. Matt or Sharon, would you like to lead on that?
Well, I'm sure for many in the room, the first thing that comes to mind is a national dialogue, and some kind of analysis, some kind of conversation seems to be particularly essential within Mali and within its political military class and the groups in the north in order to really kind of build trust and come to some kind of united or at least unified solution, development of possible solutions. A little optimistic to think they would come up with solutions, but it's really important to have everybody's voice heard. I think that a lot of what we've been seeing and what has caused the conflict, the tensions, and the misunderstandings is this lack of dialogue that happens because of distance, because of language, because of culture, literacy, whatever. There are a whole host of reasons. But those are really good points. As far as economic issues, if I could kind of jump to that, there's been a lot of wrestling with how to encourage and employ a lot of the young people in the north whose traditional livelihoods have been eroded by various factors such as climate change and basically just kind of modern times. It's something that we struggle with in the United States and probably everywhere else in the world. So while we have made some inroads in terms of identifying ways to reintegrate youth into and provide them with more economic opportunities, at some point it's going to have to, it's kind of like participation in gangs, and there's a lot that can be drawn from the whole gang literature, that there are certain consequences when one starts to associate with illicit networks. And if those consequences are serious enough, then people will look actively to make other decisions. I'm going to stop there.
I am colonel. I think like a colonel. ACME has been in the north of Mali for many years. And for many years, any Western forces invade the North Mali. The triggers for this operation, French operation, it's the move from forces to the south. Because if you break a country, it's very difficult to rebuild this country. For example, in Syria, what's happened the next years in Syria, in Somalia? This is very difficult. This is, I think, the trigger for the French operation. But the situation in North Mali is, for many years, nobody are involved in the situation. This is a concern of Malian people, and nobody wants to deal with this concern. This is the part of the explication. For Algeria, I think ACME or jihadists or the North forces made one strategic mistake, is to attack in Amiras. Because today, Algerians choose one side. Before, they never choose one side for national interest. No, I am French, and it's difficult to speak with Algerian people, but no, really choose the side. For Algerian people, maybe they choose the good way to solve the Malian concern. No Western intervention, no French people on the ground. Yes, this is, I think, a good way for Algerian people to deal with the Malian North Malian. But today, Algerian forces will be involved in the solution. Maybe not on the ground of Mali ground, but along the Algerian border. And I think this is a big mistake, strategic mistake for the North forces.
Okay, thank you, Matt.
Yes. Well, I think as far as I'm concerned, when we discuss terrorism, we need to be a little bit careful and just go back into history here. Because there was a time where there were folks who were talking about terrorism as a threat, transnational, international threat. And others did not think it was a big deal. Back in 86, 87, when François Mitterrand, French president, went to the UN because there was some kind of activity within Paris and other cities that he viewed this was something we need to pay attention to. There was one country at the UN that said, well, no, that's just your problem. It's not a big deal. Okay? In 92, when the Algerians were fighting, they also called this is a terrorist activity. All was quiet on the Western Front. 95, Mubarak, also when there was some kind of attack on tourists or whatever, also raised that as an issue. Terrorism was not an issue until one country was hit. So just have to forgive or understand those who have some kind of reluctance and they don't know what you are really talking about when you talk about it. Might be very important, serious to you now, but there was a time where it was serious to others, why you didn't pay attention to that. So that's a reality we need to kind of bear in mind when we are dealing with that issue. Mali, as a governance issue, no debate as far as I'm concerned. Because if you go back from 1961-64, you have rebellion. But even before that, 1914, 16, you have the same guys raising some concern vis-a-vis the French when they were still French Sudan, Sudan Francais. Okay? So you think when you have a new government, you start thinking about those grievances they had. I don't think in terms of Bamako, anybody took that seriously. So you have 61 to 64, 91 to 92, you have 96, 2006, and every time you come up with some kind of agreement, a national pact, it was called at some point, a whole set of things that need to be done. At the end, nothing is being done. That is not really helping the situation as far as I'm concerned. So it is a governance issue. In the meantime, you have a corruption, embezzlement, all kind of problem going left and right. Tuaregs are blamed, which is true to some extent, which go back to the whole amalgamation that I was talking about. We, from the West to a lot of people, even some Africans, we have a Tuareg problem. All the Tuaregs are rebels. All the Tuaregs are terrorists or traffickers, which is not the case. Okay? And until, to me, the South, the politician in Bamako, put the act together, think seriously, use different parameters, variables, to analyze this situation, I think we'll be stuck. And I'm not even sure the West will come and help until Bamako put its act together.
All right, and then Johanna, did you want to give your reflections?
Just one quick comment. I think Angela's question is an important one if there are other places. I would go back to my own regional experience in the Americas where, on the one hand, in Colombia, there were efforts to stabilize regions with some degree of success in the north when the guerrilla forces had been flushed out and pushed into the south. And the challenge in all of these cases, and Colombia has always been the model of an exception because it's an economy which functions in spite of it having a 60-year internal war. But it reached a point where this was becoming so corrosive that USAID had changed its strategy with the cooperation of the Colombian government in pushing it to work on these longer-term development bans. The problem right now is that that project is coming to an end, and how do you sustain it? I mean, in the case of a country which has resources like Colombia, they should be sustaining it. Bamako has another bigger problem in Mali in that the resources aren't there. It's more in the category of a country which is dependent on foreign aid, and you don't see anybody stepping forward to do that. And I think coupled with the problem that in all cases, when you give your aid into a government that is neither accountable nor has the capacity to do the accountability, if you give it the benefit of the doubt, you certainly undermine any kind of citizen confidence in the capacity of the government to deliver services.
Okay, great. All right, we have time for one more round, and then we'll wrap up. So let us start back here.
Sorry, thank you.
Good morning. My name is Cynthia Macias. I'm a former Peace Corps volunteer, and I was actually placed in Mali. I was there last year during the coup, so that was exciting, exciting times. I like to actually refer to the issue of governance that we've been talking about and kind of allude to the question of democracy and the election. So it's a main argument that in order for Mali to begin this process, stabilization and development in general, there needs to be a solid democratic government in place. So we all know that right now they're in transition, and they've been trying to push for elections coming up in April. That is somewhat of an unrealistic time frame, I would say, with so many refugees outside of the country. I mean, just simply the logistical aspect of how to set up elections in which the whole country can participate in. So my question is, from our standpoint in this side and development aspect of it, how do we address all the factors we've been talking about of creating a national dialogue, of sending resources, of military assistance and training, when in the first place the most important thing is to be able to have a stable democratic government in place? So far, from what we know, the coup leaders and counters to go are still sort of in the background of politics and a little bit unwillingly to leave control of the government. So my question is, how do we even address that, and what are the repercussions of not having that government in initiating this stabilization and transitional process? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. You've hit on obviously a schizophrenic challenge we had in putting together the panel today. Obviously, the problems in Bamako are just as serious as the ones we were talking about in northern Mali. For the purposes of trying to be focused, we concentrated today's discussions on northern Mali. you've inconveniently brought us back to the reality that we can't ignore that. And so I know Dr. Matt for sure will have something to say about that, and it certainly is important. Okay, please, right here.
Jacques Bahati. I want to address the issue of French intervention. When we look in the media, there is strong condemnation of the French. And I think current generations want to make peace with the French. Are the French ready to go to the Africans and say, we agree that we committed this humanitarian crime, economic crime, and submit themselves to a restorative justice so that new generations can have a more positive relationship with the new generations of French in the countries they colonize, and apply this to all the colonial powers. That is one of the, so that your intervention can be received in a positive way, as a cooperation. I want to address the issue of maybe a separate country for the Tuareg. Talking about the values, the West has different values from Africans, and more importantly, from the people in that region. Our kings used to go to other kings and were received. Do you think today Obama, with what he stands for, can be received as a king, as a leader in this region, given his values? Probably not. There are people who, the women there, for example, the people in this region, they don't agree with homosexuality, different values as far as women, and so on. So are we ready to interact and have a cultural exchange and values? How can we integrate that in our solutions? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. One more burning question. Okay, over here.
Colonel Retired Chris Holshek, Senior Fellow Alliance for Peace Building. I'm going to give a quick double shot. I've heard around town now, and also from AFRICOM, a couple different places, this growing idea that the security and development engagement in Niger is somehow a model by which we may be able to apply in Mali. I'd like the panel to comment on that. And the other one is the French proposal in the front of the UN to retrain the Malian army on two tracks. One is sort of the traditional train and equip. The other is institution building. If you could, Colonel, please explain that a little bit more. Thank you.
Okay, why don't we finish with you, Matt, and give others a chance to chip in first. Sharon, do you, would you like to jump in on something?
It's a very interesting question, the question of elections. And when I was there in December in 2012, I remember participating in a very big dialogue debate with some of the most senior development specialists at USAID on the question of whether or not elections should take place first, or whether or not the situation in the north needed to be addressed first. And being a kind of a governance person myself, I was pretty emphatic that elections needed to take place before the situation in the north was resolved, thinking that the international community needs a viable partner in order to go and do these kinds of security and stabilization activities. Unanimously across the board, nobody would hear of it. Nobody would hear of having elections in Mali before the north was secured. It was a non-starter. It was universally, categorically rejected. Now, what I took from that was that the sentiment of nationalism and national identity, that even if only 10% of Mali resides in the north, the sense, at least from the south, is that they are an integrated, unified national territory with a national identity. Again, some people have mentioned in the crowd whether or not that same sentiment would be shared by groups in the north. I'm not sure. But in Bamako, it was very, very clear that nobody would consider anything short of of they would not consider elections before there was some resolution and that people in the North were able to vote.
Okay, thank you. Patrick.
If I well understand the question, is the question about the training of the African army. French forces has set up many training centers in West Africa because West Africans speak French. And sorry?
The United Nations Security Council.
I'm not sure I understand what you want. I am not a political official. I don't know exactly what's happened in the UN, Council about the Mali.
Yes.
I don't know the... No, I don't.
Let me, in terms of election, I can understand why in Bamako you have that, because the whole sense is the Tuareg have felt neglected, abandoned. Now you are going to have an election where they are fighting to have what kind of regime or government to do what. The whole thing, just even the whole idea of having election before the country is stabilized or stable, to me, doesn't really make that much sense. Now, in terms of Sanogo, and maybe I could share this with you briefly, because when the coup occurred, because I'm the one helping ECOWAS in terms of strategic training on behalf of the US government, and I was called to discuss what needs to be done. My suggestion was very simple. Bring these guys to Ouagadougou, feed them well, and put them in jail. To me, that was the answer for two reasons. Coup d'etat are no longer allowed within West Africa. Once you say there's no more coup d'etat, they are proscribed. Why are you treating somebody who staged a coup with honor? It makes no sense to me. But everybody was like, concerned, and I'm too radical, blah, blah, blah. I said, well, if you leave Sanogo, you are never going to resolve that issue. And here we are. Okay. Now, as far as my brother, whether the French are ready to kind of restart, that's what you are talking about. My question would be whether the Africans are ready, not the French. The reality, you still have African countries up today that are pegging the currency to the euro through the French government. After so many years of independence, quote unquote. So to me, we need to look into our own selves. I don't blame the French or anybody anymore. What are we doing ourselves to our own people? Which come to the second set of questions. The first value to me, if you want to talk about value, is how you treat your own people. That's the very first value as far as I'm concerned. If you don't respect your people, you don't treat them well, you call them cockroaches or whatever, somebody is going to come and help you, teach you how you should treat your own people. In that case, you have no more ammunition. So we need to really rethink. I'm really introspectively, we need to go into ourselves as Africans, what we want, where do we want to go, as opposed to continuing blaming others. For the security engagement in Niger, as far as I'm concerned, that could be a model, a template. What that means is simply we don't go as the US. Now I'm talking as the US. Gee, you don't go into a country and tell them, I know what you need to do. We've done that for so long, and we know where we are. Okay? You go, listen, study the culture, trying to communicate, have a dialogue as opposed to several monologues. I know best does not help. We know that now. If you go in and listen carefully, they might look stupid, but they won't sound stupid. Just listen to what they are saying to you, and you get the proper, what you can do, because you can't help somebody who doesn't want to be helped. We have a tendency to so, whereas in the US we say, may I help you? When we go outside, we say, no, I need to help you. You can't do that. It got to be, may I help you? When they say yes, how may I help you now after the first question? If you do that and use the model of, and make sure we combine security and development hand in hand through governance. I don't even talk about good governance. To me, governing is to manage well. So there's no good governance as far as I'm concerned. And we need to have governance on the continent. And if the West can, while they are taking into account their own national interests, can think about the interests of the other too, which might be part of their national interest, I think we all will be fine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Well, that's why I wanted to have you finish for us, to end on an energetic note. I asked the panel to help us to think about ways forward, to put out some priorities. I think they've done that. I wanted to summarize just a couple of things that, some themes that have come up again and again. First, and I don't know that we answered the question directly, but I do think there was a message here about security sector reform being a priority. And that, yes, there's some tactics and training equipment that's required, but the real emphasis has to be on the institution building, the structural changes that are required if you're going to see stability in the North and in the South. There's been a real breakdown on that. Secondly, is that this is a regional problem. And while the focus right now is on Northern Mali, it really needs regional solutions. There needs to be collaboration, again, within the cell and then internationally. We're dealing with, as Johanna said, a problem of porous borders, and of borderless threats. And this, by definition, will require some transnational arrangements. A third theme was the importance of local engagements. And this has been a missing ingredient in past efforts for development in the North. And really, right now, there's an open question about where the support of local government in the North will be. And there's a deep level of mistrust. So it's going to require a sustained effort. And fourth, which is related to all the others, is the importance of accountability. That this is clearly critical in terms of the use of resources, but it also gets to the issue of where we're going to prioritize. And even responding to Angela's questions about how do you engage the Tuareg. Well, unless there's accountability, and with that we are by necessity linked to the issue of legitimacy of the government in the North, how do you engage the Tuareg in a way that isn't singling them out as being responsible for the challenges? That is going to require some sort of partnership engagement, whether that be from ECOWAS or from the broader international community, to make sure that there's accountability in whatever structures are used to move forward. So as we draw here to a close, before we thank the panel, I do want to just briefly acknowledge my colleague, Devin O'Regan, who is largely responsible for this event, from the conceptualization to helping to identify speakers, coordinating and actually executing that event. So Devin, thank you very much for all of your effort. And thank you to the rest of my ACSS colleagues for all of your contributions as well. And again, I want to thank everybody for turning out the excellent questions, the very focused dialogue that we've been able to have. Obviously, there's so much more we need to follow up on, but I think we've accomplished what we wanted to today, and at least deepening some of the understanding and giving some guidance to how we want to move forward. So thanks to the audience, and thank you to the panelists for all your preparation and great ideas today.